Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Questions for today's presenter can be entered into the questions section. Any questions we don't get to today will be answered offline to the email you provided during registration. Today's presentation will be recorded, and you will receive information in a few days on how to access the recording. At this time, let's go ahead and begin the formal part of this presentation. Welcome everyone to Current in 30, the 30-minute webinar series brought to you by the Current Consulting Group. We are thrilled to have you with us. To briefly introduce this series, each session is designed to keep you informed, efficient, and ahead of the curve. On the second and fourth Mondays of each month throughout 2026, we'll break down key things you need to know about workplace drug screening, from emerging trends and regulatory updates to best practices and practical implementation tips. If you missed our previous sessions, please visit our website, currentconsultinggroup.com, or our YouTube channel at Current Consulting Group to view those sessions. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Greta Walsh of the Current Consulting Group, and today's presentation is titled 2026 State Laws and Legislation, a Mid-Year Report. This presentation qualifies for half of a professional development credit from SHRM and HRCI for those who attend today's presentation in its entirety. Today's presentation welcomes the founder and president of the Current Consulting Group, Bill Current. Among Bill's many accomplishments, he founded the Current Consulting Group in 1998. He is the former VP of Consulting at Employee Information Services. He is the former Executive Director of the American Council for Drug Education. He is the former Director of the Institute for a Drug-Free Workplace. He has authored 11 books on substance abuse prevention and drug testing, including his 2026 release, What Every Employer Should Know About Marijuana. And lastly, Bill is currently a member of the Board of Directors at Endesa and Board of Trustees at the Endesa Foundation. And now it is my pleasure to turn it over to our presenter, Bill Current from the Current Consulting Group.
Thank you, Greta, and welcome everyone to today's webinar presentation. We're going to talk about 2026 state drug testing laws and legislation as sort of a mid-year update. So we're not going to go through all 50 states' laws and things of that nature. That would, take several webinars to do. But we are going to talk about some laws and some of the major legislative updates. Some legislation has already been enacted this year that's new that you need to be aware of. And we're also going to talk about some progressing legislation that you need to be aware of, including some marijuana laws that would have a direct impact on workplace drug testing. Now, I know it's challenging to keep up to date on these state laws. We do offer a service at the Current Consulting Group called Current Compliance. That is an online database of state drug testing laws, or I should say state laws that affect workplace drug testing. And if you subscribe to Current Compliance, you would just simply go to our website at currentconsultinggroup.com. In the right-hand corner, you would see your login information for Current Consulting Group or Current Compliance, and it would take you to your login page for Current Compliance. Put in your unique password and username, just unique to you. Only you can use it. Nobody can get in there and steal your information. And then it'll take you to the website for Current Compliance. There you have choices. You can look at state summaries, you can look at single issues, or you can search the database. And so let me just give you a brief overview of how that works. Let's say you want to look at one state, Florida state laws. So you would click on the map. There's also a list. You can do it that way, but you could click on the map, click on Florida, and it'll take you to the Florida page. And on the Florida page, you'll find a brief heads up, which is just sort of a brief summary of the legal status of drug testing in Florida. And then you'll find links to all the different sections of our database that have to do with Florida law. So you'll see general case law. You'll see, in this case, the voluntary workers' comp premium discount law. There's two different sections for that. You'll find medical marijuana and recreational marijuana, as well as any case law if there is for a state. And then workers and unemployment compensation laws, which function different than state drug testing laws, but in almost every state can have a direct impact on drug testing. And then you see to the right, you see the citations. You can click on any of those, and it'll actually take you to the very source that we use to create that section of the database. You can also search the database by single issues. And so let's say, just looking at the top there, alcohol testing, if you clicked on alcohol testing, it would show you all 50 states, and then those states that have a law that says something specific about alcohol testing will be highlighted so that you can compare state by state in their alcohol testing laws. And you can see there's a lot of different subjects. This just shows the top of the page there, but follow-up testing, drug panels, the cost of drug testing. You can click on any one of those and it'll compare all 50 states side by side by side. Okay, so if you're interested, if that's something you need, let us know at Current Compliance. You get a nice discount if you're an NDASA member or a SAPA member, or a PBSA member for that matter. And we'd love to have you as a subscriber. There's a lot that comes with it. I'll talk about that a little bit later at the end. Today's agenda is going to be a brief state law primer. We're just going to talk a little bit about what kinds of laws are out there, and those are the ones that are covered in our state law database, Current Compliance. Then I'm going to give you an update on 2026 legislation and recently enacted laws. That's going to be the bulk of today's presentation. And then we'll talk a little bit about marijuana laws to watch. Now, as many of you know, at the Current Consulting Group, we do two major surveys every year. One of the drug testing industry, which we present every year at the NDASA conference. We just presented the 2026 survey results at the NDASA conference in Anaheim, California. It's our 28th annual drug testing industry survey. And then later in the year, we do an employer drug testing survey, which we present the results of at the SAPA conference. So that's coming up. We'll be conducting that survey very soon, and then we'll be releasing the results at the SAPA conference. If you're interested in participating in this year's survey, just let us know. We'd be very happy to involve you in that. Now, from last year's employer survey, we asked the question, what are the biggest challenges to performing drug tests? And you can see, excuse me, there's lots of different categories, right? I just want to focus on the three that have arrows pointing at them: state drug testing laws, marijuana legalization, and keeping our policy up to date. So 25% said state drug testing laws, 34% said marijuana legalization, and 20% said keeping policies up to date. Those all have to do with the topic of today's webinar, right? Changing laws, legislation, and particularly the legalization of marijuana with language in a state law that affects the workplace, affects drug testing. Those are all challenges that have to be addressed in your drug testing policy. So keeping your drug testing policy up to date can be very challenging in this sort of legislative era of legal marijuana, let's call it. So there are laws changing constantly every year. So, and we'll talk about those here in a second. And then we asked the question in that same survey, why did you last update your drug testing policy? And as you can see, the top two answers pertain to today's presentation: in response to recent state law changes and to comply with legal marijuana laws where we have business operations. Now, one of the things we do at the Current Consulting Group is we write drug testing policies. Many drug testing companies use our service, our policy development services, because we're not a TPA. We don't sell drug testing. We don't compete with them, but we do specialize in policy development. And one of the most common questions we get asked on a regular basis is, I'm in multiple states. Which state law do we need to comply with to build our policy? And the answer is you have to comply with all the states where you have business operations. So if you're a company in 30 states, you may have a base policy with multiple addendums to the policy, depending on differences that may exist from one state to another in terms of their state drug testing laws, requirements, restrictions, etc. And especially when it comes to the marijuana laws. So that's an issue that comes up a lot, okay? And when you think about drug testing laws, you look at the different kinds of laws that affect drug testing. So for example, there are mandatory drug testing laws, like in Iowa, where every employer in the state of Iowa that wants to do drug testing must comply with that mandatory law. And then there are states with voluntary laws, like here in Florida, where I live, where we have a voluntary drug testing law that offers a workers' comp premium discount to companies that drug test in accordance with the requirements of the voluntary law. So there are several states, as you can see there, about 17 states with mandatory laws and 16 states with voluntary laws. There are also states that have case law. They could be a state with a mandatory or voluntary law, or they may be a state that doesn't have a drug testing law per se, but they have a lot of case law. You have to look at the case law in order to understand the latest provisions that apply to drug testing in a particular state. And then there are workers and unemployment compensation regulations. These are states that allow employers to move to deny benefits to somebody who tests positive in some situation, like in a post-accident situation where a workers' comp claim has been filed and the individual tested positive for drugs or alcohol. Depending on the state, right, but it's speaking in very general terms, you may actually have the right as an employer to move to deny the payment of those benefits if the individual tested positive. Depends on your state's regulations. There are some states with industry-specific laws that require drug testing and require drug testing to be conducted a certain way. Illinois is a perfect example where they have a public works contractors law that applies to public works contractors in the state, and they must drug test in accordance with that specific law. Doesn't apply to other employers in the state, just to public works contractors. And I might add that many of those types of laws, including the Illinois law, not entirely, but for the most part, mirror the federal regulations, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And then, of course, there are the medical and recreational marijuana laws, many of which have some type of language that pertains to the workplace that either restricts when testing for marijuana can take place, or how testing for marijuana has to be conducted, or what an employer can do with a positive drug test result for marijuana. So when you're putting your policy together and you're reviewing the state laws that apply to you, you definitely want to look at the medical and the recreational marijuana laws, because many times they have specific language pertaining to the workplace and to drug testing. Now, when it comes to state laws and federal regulations, like the DOT regulations, the Department of Transportation, it's important to understand that federal regulations typically trump state laws. And in the same way, state laws trump city ordinances. So you may have, New York City has a city ordinance on drug testing, but the state also has laws on drug testing, including guidance from the Department of Labor in the state of New York, which trumps anything that the city of New York has in its ordinance. But federal regulations trump both of those. And so if you have employers in the state of New York who fall under the DOT regulations, they must comply with those DOT regulations, even if they're in some contrast with either the state laws and regulations or the New York City ordinance. So federal regulations trump state laws in the same way that state laws trump city ordinances. And many state drug testing laws actually mirror the federal regulations, as I was talking about with Illinois' public works contractors, okay? If in doubt, though, double check, because you will be held responsible to comply with the laws that apply to you. Especially important if you're in multiple states, right? Keep that in mind. You must comply with all the states that have laws where you have business operations. Now, under the DOT regulations, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on DOT today because this is really about state laws, but under the DOT regulations, covered employers must test all applicants for specific safety-sensitive transportation-related occupations. And in this age of legal marijuana, those regulations still require those covered employers to test those applicants for marijuana as well. They must subject all covered employees to drug and alcohol testing, including testing applicants and employees for marijuana, as I mentioned. Some state drug testing laws also dictate who can be tested or who must be tested, when and how the testing is going to be conducted. And so it's very important that even if you're not covered by the DOT regulations, you look at the state laws that apply to you, because they could have aspects of the federal regulations built in to the state requirements. Always, always, always review all applicable laws. If you're in multiple states, you may have to have addendums to your policy to cover differences that exist from one state to the next. If you're in drug testing friendly states like Texas, for example, you're going to have maybe a different set of requirements for drug testing of employees in Texas versus a more restrictive state like, say, New York or Massachusetts. So now let's go and look at the 2026 legislation and some recently enacted laws. Some of these new laws have gone into effect or are about to go into effect. Some of them get passed and they get signed by the governor, but don't go into effect until the following year in some cases. So always check that in the date in which it becomes actually enacted. Okay. So I'm going to give you several examples. In Maine, for example, the governor signed a new law in April that becomes effective in July. So coming up here, right in the month that we're in right now as we're recording this webinar presentation. Very important, second bullet, employers can now use a non-instrumented FDA cleared device to screen employees for urine or saliva, oral fluid. This is a rapid result test, a point of collection test. Some people still call it on-site testing, but it's a non-instrumented FDA cleared device. So that's a particular requirement there that you need to be aware of. If you're in Maine, you can do that type of testing either with urine or saliva, but you must use an FDA cleared device. Point of collection results must be released immediately to the donor. Can't sit on that, you've got to let them know. And the second to last bullet, prohibition on breath alcohol testing is repealed. So probably never was a good idea anyway. They've now repealed it officially, okay? And the last bullet, testing programs are no longer required to be developed by a committee of employees. So they've made drug testing a little friendlier in the state of Maine, but that's not all. Minor wording adjustments throughout the law have to be reviewed, especially regarding how it defines probable cause or reasonable suspicion. So take a close look at that. There is a new section on MROs and MRO procedures that you need to be aware of. You may not be an MRO, but you want to know what requirements your MRO has to comply with. And then the third bullet, an employee must be provided with written rationale for a reasonable suspicion test prior to the test taking place. Okay. And then the rehab program time period has been shortened from 6 months to 12 weeks and must now be paid for solely by the employee. So that's a big change. And if you're in Maine, drug testing has always been allowed, but it's just become more accessible now. Let's take a look at Minnesota. Now, Minnesota changed its drug testing law a couple of years ago now, I think it was, where they now allow point of collection oral fluid testing, rapid result oral fluid testing. This year, the law was updated in August of 2025 and became immediately effective. This is employers must provide medical cannabis patients with written notice 14 days prior to taking adverse action. That's a hard standard to live by, but that's the law there now. And the citation to a specific federal law or regulation must be revealed if the employer is going to use that as an excuse to bypass some of the requirements of the medical cannabis law in Minnesota. In addition to that, in most cases, employers may not discriminate. This is very common. You find this in a lot of medical marijuana laws throughout the country, based solely on enrollment in a medical cannabis program or a tribal medical cannabis program, and a patient's cannabis positive drug test cannot be used against them. You can't discriminate unless the patient used or was impaired by cannabis at work. So on the job, marijuana use still prohibited. Being impaired by marijuana while on the job, still prohibited. Employers cannot retaliate against patients for asserting their rights or seeking remedies under the Minnesota medical cannabis law. Oklahoma. This was signed in April of this year and becomes effective in November of this year. And basically, this is a different take altogether. Employers cannot take adverse employment action based solely on a cannabis positive test unless action is taken based on a written drug and alcohol testing policy that follows Oklahoma state drug testing law. Safety sensitive employees are subject to zero tolerance drug and alcohol standards. That is a title we don't hear much anymore these days in this more lenient era that we live in, but they can be subject to zero tolerance for drug and alcohol. And this applies regardless of policies permitting impairment-based testing, so non-drug tests that measure impairment. There are a lot of technologies out there now that can do that, or alternative standards for non-safety sensitive positions. Oklahoma, Very unique there. In addition, this is important, that first bullet there, nothing limits an employer's ability to implement and enforce written drug and alcohol testing policies. Oklahoma is still a very employer drug testing friendly state. And the second bullet, including policies prohibiting the use of cannabis in the workplace or while performing job duties. Employers still have the right to prohibit employees from using marijuana at work or from being impaired by marijuana while on the job. So as I mentioned, Oklahoma is still a very employer drug testing friendly state. Now, one of the things we do with subscribers to our current compliance online state law database is send out a monthly legislative update. We call it Leg Up. And so we will report on all the active legislation that's still out there, that's still progressing. Or if something has stopped progressing, we'll report that as well. So when you subscribe to current compliance, you get a monthly legislative update. If you're in multiple states or you have clients that are in multiple states, very, very important that you have this kind of information. Let me give you an example of some of the legislation to watch in 2026. So Alabama SB 327 requires written notice to employees of policy, additional notice 10 days before any changes are made. You find that language in some state laws right now. Alabama is legislatively looking to add that requirement to their state drug testing laws. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I've highlighted some sections in orange, as you can see. Indiana SB 0286, medical and recreational cannabis legalization, employer rights protected. Not all state marijuana laws have employer rights protected in the language of their statute. Indiana would. You're seeing a lot of psilocybin legislation this year. I would say that in 2026, we're looking at probably over 500 bills that have been introduced at the state level that, if enacted, would affect workplace drug testing. Now, many of them will not be enacted, but some of them will either be enacted this year or pass this year, be enacted this year or next year, or be carried over to a future legislative season. And so you just have to keep on top of these and always look for any progress that a bill is making in a state that applies to you. I wanted to point out one. Oh, right. If you go to the next column over, Massachusetts H2179 and S1148, this would, generally speaking, okay, we have to see how this would actually get passed, but employees and applicants may not be required to be tested for cannabis as a condition of employment. Wow, that would just, put an end to drug testing for marijuana in the state of Massachusetts. And then you see they also have a psilocybin bill that's making its way through the legislature there. Again, other states, a lot of psilocybin. In New Jersey's S784, employers can prohibit the use of cannabis for employees in certain positions. These are typically safety-sensitive type of positions. New Jersey, no adverse employment action against medical cannabis patients in most circumstances. A lot of these types of laws, and I haven't highlighted all of them, but as you can see, there are a lot of them. And let me just go back one slide. There was one I wanted to point out. Let's see, there it is. So I missed this earlier. Massachusetts H159 S98, that's in the second column about halfway down. This would prohibit testing employees and taking adverse employment action based on a THC metabolite type of drug test. This already exists in the state of California and the state of Washington. I'll just use California as an example. In California, a few years ago, they passed a law that would prohibit employers from taking action based on a positive test for cannabis when the test result was only capable of showing the metabolite of cannabis as opposed to the parent drug. This eliminates urine testing for marijuana in the state of California. However, Because oral fluid shows the presence of the parent drug or the drug itself, you can test for marijuana and take employment action based on a positive if it's based on an oral fluid test that shows the parent drug. Massachusetts is looking at legislation that would be very similar to the prohibitions that exist in California when it comes to testing with a test result that can only show, or a testing method that can only show the metabolite of cannabis, which is what urine shows. Very interesting development there. And then just fast forwarding, here are some states that have medical cannabis legalization measures still active and recreational cannabis legalization efforts out there. Over 40 states have legalized marijuana in some respect. So we're seeing more states following following the example out there that we see in states like New York and Massachusetts, for example, by legalizing medical marijuana and recreational marijuana. Many of these laws that you see, or I should say, many of these bills that are represented by the states you see on the screen here, are addendums or amendments to an existing marijuana law, where they're adding restrictions on employers' rights, or they're adding anti-discrimination language. A few, not many, a few are adding language that clarifies employers' rights to test for marijuana of employees, say, in safety-sensitive positions, etc. So these are some of the states that still have active legislation out there right now, okay? Now, let's talk about marijuana specifically here for a second. There are laws in existence right now, and there is a lot of confusion, really, when it comes to marijuana laws. The truth of the matter is you can test for marijuana in all 50 states. It's very, very difficult, though, to justify it in states like New York. I'll just use that as one example. There is a little sliver of opportunity in a very specific type of reasonable suspicion scenario in which an employer could test for marijuana. But for the most part, it's prohibited in New York. But I say it's legal in all 50 states because even in New York, there are circumstances in which you could test for marijuana. And of course, we're not talking about the federal regulations. The DOT regulations trump these prohibitions, okay? But we're talking about medical marijuana, recreational marijuana, disability discrimination, which is very common in these marijuana laws nowadays. And of course, federal regulated employees, the DOT, and how they must be treated when it comes to testing for marijuana, even in states that have legalized marijuana. So what you're looking for, and this would be a great webinar to do, but what you're looking for are medical marijuana laws with no accommodations for the use of medical marijuana. That's 21 states have that language. And you're looking at medical marijuana state laws that have required accommodation language. That's another 21 states plus the District of Columbia. Recreational marijuana with accommodations for users, that exists in 10 states plus the District of Columbia. And as I mentioned before, sort of the atypical state laws like California and Washington that prohibit testing and taking action based on a testing method that is only capable of showing the metabolite of cannabis rather than the parent drug. And I mentioned New York also because it's not actually a state law in New York that prohibits drug testing. It's a ruling from the State Department of Labor that specifically states that testing for marijuana is not allowed. And then there's this small explanation underneath it of this tiny sliver of opportunity or window of opportunity for testing for marijuana in the state of New York. So that's why I'm able to say you can test for marijuana in all 50 states, but very, very narrow opportunity in New York, and can't test for marijuana using urine in California and Washington, and maybe if the bill gets passed in Massachusetts. I think we'll see more of those kinds of laws in the near future. Now, there's a lot of talk today about the rescheduling of marijuana, moving it from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 of the Controlled Substances Act. In Schedule 1, that's where you find amphetamines and heroin and other very dangerous drugs. And Schedule 3 is where you find substances like Tylenol with codeine. And the Trump administration has now moved to reclassify marijuana as a Schedule 3 drug instead of a Schedule 1 drug. Personally, I think it's where it should be at Schedule 1. But in April of this year, the acting Attorney General, Todd Blanche, signed a directive to begin the process of downgrading marijuana to Schedule 3. And so that's in the motion. There are a lot of lawsuits out there right now to try to interfere with that movement because people are claiming that the administration bypassed Congress and did it on their own without the authority to do that. And a lot of other issues that are out there. I will say I serve on the board of directors of NDASA, and NDASA is very active on this issue. Our executive director, Joe McGuire, has been a voice of clarity and reason on this issue, and she just testified in a DEA hearing on this issue. NDASA held a press conference in Washington, D.C. earlier this year. And so we're doing a lot through NDASA, but it's really something that all employers and providers of drug testing should be concerned about, because there's no telling what kind of restrictions would come into play once marijuana is fully rescheduled to Schedule 3. Some people fear that DOT would lose the authority to require testing for marijuana of safety-sensitive transportation occupations like truck drivers and airline pilots. I don't know if it'll come to that, but we're fighting right now for a safety carve-out to make it still possible for employers to test for marijuana in the transportation industry under the DOT regulations. Now, in conclusion, we can help you with these issues at the Current Consulting Group. Current Compliance and Leg Up are among the services that we provide. We also write drug testing policies that are customized. Every single policy we write is customized. So we don't do drug testing. We don't compete with the companies that resell our services because we're not in the drug testing business. We provide support services to help your clients, if you're a provider, comply with the laws that apply to them. And if you're an employer, to help you comply with the laws that apply to your company. So if you need help with that, please let us know. We would be happy to provide information to make it possible for you to comply with the laws that apply to your company and to stay up to date on the legislation that is progressing through all 50 states, basically. So with that, I conclude today's presentation. Thank you for joining us. Please be aware that we have another webinar presentation coming up on July 27th with my associate, Brian Feely. And so with that, let me turn it back over to Greta.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you to everyone joining us for today's edition of Current in 30. We hope that today's insights have helped you stay informed and confident in your workplace drug screening decisions. As a reminder, this presentation was recorded, and you will receive instructions in a few days on how to access the recording. Additionally, this presentation qualified for half of a continuing education credit from Sherman HRCI for those who attended today's presentation in its entirety. If you have met that requirement, we will email you those activity IDs in a few days. Remember, we'll be back every second and fourth Monday of 2026 with things you need to know to stay current in this industry. Be sure to follow the Current Consulting Group and check your inbox for upcoming session details. Until next time, stay current and have a great day.